On a cold March morning in 1943, a Japanese officer who had been prepared to die rather than fall into enemy hands found himself staring at a tray of food that looked more like a feast than a death. Sentence: roast beef with steaming gravy, a mound of creamy potatoes, bright green beans, warm bread with butter, and even a slice of apple pie. He had been told for years that Americans were barbarians who would torture and kill him. Yet here he sat in a spotless hospital bed in Wisconsin, his wounds carefully treated, and more meat before him than he had seen in half a year. For Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, this was not just a meal. It was the collapse of 15 years of indoctrination, the shattering of every lesson hammered into him since boyhood. The propaganda of Imperial Japan had promised that America was weak, cruel, and incapable of sacrifice. But what he saw that day in Camp McCoy was abundance, care, and humanity. And that shocking moment was only the beginning of a journey that would transform thousands of Japanese prisoners of war and ultimately reshape Japan itself after the Pacific War. And as he lifted his fork, Camp McCoy's ward became the stage where his entire world would collapse. Chapter 1: The Forbidden Meal. The hospital ward at Camp McCoy in Wisconsin could not have been more different from the jungles of Guadalcanal. Outside, snow lay heavy on pine trees, muffling the land in silence. Inside, the infirmary radiated order, beds lined in perfect rows, sheets bleached white, instruments gleaming beneath electric light. For Tanaka, every detail pressed against the edges of his indoctrination. His hands trembled, not from fever, but from disbelief. The doctrine of the Imperial Japanese Army had prepared him for many things: bayonet charges, starvation, suicide, but not for kindness. To accept food from an American was to accept that the propaganda might be false. The bite of roast beef was not just nourishment, it was betrayal of a narrative carved into him since youth. Each swallow undermined the certainty that America was decadent, soft, incapable of endurance. Here was food richer than anything his own family in Tokyo could hope for. Here was care that surpassed what Japanese civilians received at home. The abundance was not limited to food. His wounds, infected in the humid jungles, had been cleaned and stitched with precision. Dressings were changed twice daily, and unlike in Japanese field hospitals, where cloth was boiled and reused until it disintegrated, here each bandage was discarded after a single use. The sheer waste seemed obscene, yet it was routine. Around him, other prisoners experienced the same cognitive collapse. Men who had prepared to bite down on grenades, rather than surrender, now lay stunned beneath soft sheets. Some whispered suspicions that this was an elaborate ploy to extract information, that the pie was drugged, that the kindness was camouflage. But the days stretched into weeks, and no torture came, only meals, dressings, and the monotonous rhythm of hospital care. Tanaka's whispered protest, "This cannot be real," became the first step in a transformation that would ripple across thousands of prisoners. By the time spring arrived in Wisconsin, a dangerous truth was sinking in. America's strength did not lie only in weapons. It lay in an abundance so overwhelming it could be extended even to enemies. Chapter 2: Empire of Propaganda. To understand the depth of Tanaka's disbelief, one must return to the world that shaped him. In the 1930s, Japan wove a web of propaganda designed not merely to misinform, but to condition an entire society for war. Newspapers and radio broadcasts, controlled tightly by the government, painted Americans as morally weak and racially inferior. Headlines declared them decadent consumers, obsessed with comfort and incapable of sacrifice. In classrooms, children memorized songs, praising the emperor, while mocking American laziness. Textbooks proclaimed that a single Japanese soldier possessed the spirit of 10 Americans. Teachers lectured that while Japan stood for unity and discipline, the United States was a nation fractured by selfishness. The seeds planted in childhood grew into convictions carried onto battlefields. The military drilled recruits relentlessly, Officers lectured that surrender was dishonorable, worse than death itself. Manuals instructed soldiers to save the last bullet for themselves or to charge the enemy in a final act of sacrifice, rather than fall captive. Prisoners, they were told, would be tortured for amusement, their bodies desecrated. The very thought of capture was framed as treachery to family and emperor alike. The press reinforced the image. After Pearl Harbor, on the 7th of December in 1941, propaganda surged to fever pitch. Articles insisted that American factories were already failing, that strikes and riots crippled production, that citizens refused rationing. Military briefings told soldiers that American medical services were primitive, leaving their wounded to die unattended. Imperial War Ministry pamphlets declared that America's industry was corrupt, incapable of sustaining long campaigns. Even those Japanese who had traveled to America before the war were silenced. Businessmen, students, and diplomats who spoke of vast factories and efficient agriculture were dismissed as liars. Their accounts clashed too harshly with the narrative needed to sustain morale. By the time men like Tanaka marched into the jungles of Guadalcanal, their beliefs were sealed. America was rich in luxuries, but poor in discipline. It was a soft nation, incapable of withstanding hardship, a society that would crumble under the strain of war. Their indoctrination left no space for what they would actually encounter, an enemy whose hospitals treated prisoners better than Japanese hospitals treated their own. Wounded. The collision of belief and reality was not gentle. It was traumatic, like waking from a lifelong dream into a blinding light. The apple pie on Tanaka's tray was not dessert. It was evidence that decades of propaganda had been lies, and that Japan had launched itself into a war against a nation whose strength was rooted not in softness, but in an inexhaustible capacity to provide, even for its enemies. Chapter 3. Factories of War. The collapse of propaganda became undeniable once prisoners glimpsed the sheer machinery of America's war effort. For years, Tokyo's officials had painted the United States as corrupt, inefficient, and fragile under pressure. But the truth, measured in furnaces and shipyards, was staggering. Between the year 1941 and the year 1945, American factories produced over 300,000 aircraft fighters, bombers, and transport planes in endless variations. In the same years, they turned out 86,000 tanks and 71,000 naval vessels, from destroyers to Liberty ships that could be built in a fortnight. The Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, astonished the world by producing a ship in 14 days, while Japanese yards strained to complete vessels, a fraction of the size over months. The weight of industry was felt most clearly in steel. In 1944 alone, American mills forged 47 million tons, while Japan managed barely 6 million. Automobiles told a similar story. In 1943, the United States produced more motor vehicles for military use than Japan had manufactured for all purposes across its entire industrial history. These figures were not abstract. They translated into living conditions for prisoners. America's abundance in physicians, hospitals, and pharmaceuticals dwarfed Japan's. For every 10,000 Americans, there were 15 doctors. In Japan, only 6. Pharmaceutical output was 18 times greater in the United States. Antibiotics and anesthetics that were fantasies in Tokyo became routine in Wisconsin and Louisiana. The Japanese who first experienced this power in the form of medicine could not ignore its implications. A bandage changed twice daily represented not just care, but industry. The spinning of cotton, the weaving of fabric, the factories that bleached and packaged them in boxes shipped across oceans. A vial of penicillin was not merely a drug. It was a monument to laboratories, chemists, and the staggering scale of an economy mobilized for war. For Tanaka and his fellow captives, the lesson arrived not from lectures, but from small acts repeated without hesitation. The Americans possessed so much that they could treat enemies with the same attention as their own. Where Japanese officers begged for grams of rice, Americans distributed rations in pounds. where Japanese hospitals washed and reused the same cloth until it fell apart. Americans discarded bandages after a single use. The abundance was not a show, it was systemic. And systems like this, prisoners realized, could not be broken by spirit alone. Chapter 4. Doctrine of Death. Long before these prisoners ever touched American soil, they had been taught that capture was impossible. The Imperial Japanese Army drilled into every recruit that surrender was worse than death, a stain that dishonored not just the individual, but his ancestors. The code demanded suicide before captivity, whether by bullet, grenade, or desperate charge. This doctrine was not rhetorical. Training manuals specified the final bullet reserved for oneself. Recruits rehearsed mock last stands, learning to see death as the logical conclusion of battle. The culture of shame was so pervasive that soldiers often carried grenades with the pin already loosened, ready to end their lives rather than risk the disgrace of being taken alive. By mid-1942, the results of this indoctrination were clear. For every 1,000 Germans captured in Europe, fewer than 5 Japanese were taken in the Pacific. The numbers astonished American commanders, who expected to take prisoners in greater proportion. Those few who did survive into captivity usually arrived unconscious, their decision to die denied by wounds too severe to act upon. The consequence was stark. Japanese prisoners' first encounters with America almost always came from a hospital bed. They awoke not in chains but beneath clean sheets, not to interrogations but to doctors bending over their wounds. The contrast between their expectations and their reality was violent in its irony. Many resisted at first. Some refused to eat, convinced the food was poisoned. Others believed bandages hid instruments of torture. But as days passed and fevers broke, disbelief eroded. They had been told American medicine was primitive. Yet here it was, modern, abundant, systematic. They had been told surrender meant dishonor worse than death. Yet here, they remained alive, treated with a care even Japanese civilians rarely knew. The doctrine of death had left them unprepared for survival. Each new act of medical attention was not merely kindness, it was a challenge to the foundation of their loyalty. How could they reconcile an enemy who healed with the empire that had demanded they die? Some whispered to each other that perhaps it was all a trick, that torture or execution still awaited. Others began to wonder in silence whether their commanders had lied, whether Japan's leaders had gambled everything against a nation whose true power they had fatally misunderstood. The indoctrination had been absolute, but captivity exposed its fragility. The suicide order could keep men from surrendering on the battlefield. It could not hold against the daily rhythm of care that contradicted every word of propaganda. Each tray of food, each vial of medicine, each clean dressing was a wound to doctrine. Chapter 5. Guadalcanal Hunger. The battle for Guadalcanal was more than a clash of armies. It was a crucible that stripped men to the raw edge of survival. From the 7th day of August in 1942 until the 9th of February in 1943, Japanese and American forces fought across steaming jungles and ridges drenched in blood. But for Japanese soldiers, the battle was not only against bullets, it was against hunger itself. As American supply lines grew stronger, Japan's withered. Convoys from Rabaul were hunted down by American aircraft and submarines. Ships that managed to reach the island could rarely unload more than a fraction of their cargo before retreating under fire. Rice, once the foundation of every soldier's ration, became a memory. By the winter of 1942, some Japanese units received only a handful of rice per day, often less than 100 grams. Officers ordered soldiers to forage among the trees for roots, ferns, or anything remotely edible. Malaria and dysentery ravaged the troops, unchecked by medicine. Bandages ran out, leaving wounds to fester. Men boiled bark to make bitter broth. They stripped vines for sustenance, gnawed on coconut husks, and in desperate moments, chewed leather straps. Veterans later recalled the surreal agony of smelling American rations drifting from enemy lines, canned meat, coffee, and baked bread while they fought over scraps of jungle vegetation. The physical toll was devastating. Of the Japanese soldiers evacuated from Guadalcanal with wounds, fewer than 3 in 10 survived. Death came not only from combat but from malnutrition, infection, and exhaustion. Men collapsed mid-march, too weak to stand. Their bodies, wasted and feverish, became symbols of an empire overstretched, trying to fight a modern industrial war with inadequate logistics. When capture finally came, it was often involuntary. Soldiers were knocked unconscious by artillery or so debilitated by hunger that they could not raise a weapon. To such men, consciousness aboard an American hospital ship or in a stateside infirmary was surreal. They had left behind comrades dying without morphine, chewing grass to fight hunger, and awoke to beds with clean sheets and trays heavy with food. This chasm between deprivation and abundance explains why the psychological shock cut so deep. For those from Guadalcanal, the hospital bed was not just a contradiction, it was a revelation. The empire had told them America was weak, unable to sacrifice. But in captivity, they saw that America's strength was precisely its capacity to produce, to deliver, and to waste. For men reduced to chewing bark, a slice of apple pie was more than dessert. It was undeniable proof of a nation's power. Chapter 6. The Hospital Ship. For Lieutenant Kenji Watanabe, the transition from nightmare to disbelief began in the haze of anesthesia. A medical officer in the 18th Infantry Division, he had been torn apart by shrapnel in his abdomen and leg. Captured in January 1943, he expected death as soon as he fell into enemy hands. His last clear memory was of jungle mud and the echo of artillery. When he awoke, the ceiling above him was white, the sheets beneath him clean, and the air smelled not of rot, but of antiseptic. He had been brought aboard the USS Solace, an American hospital ship. Its corridors gleamed with polished metal, its wards filled with equipment that outshone even Tokyo's best hospitals. Nurses changed linens daily. Doctors bent over wounds with a calm efficiency that seemed unreal. To Watanabe, each detail was impossible. He had been told Americans mocked the wounded, leaving them to die. Yet here, strangers worked with precision to remove shrapnel from his body, operating not once but 3 times. The true shock came with medicine. Sulfa drugs were poured over his wounds in abundance. Even more extraordinary was the use of penicillin, the so-called miracle drug. In Japan, penicillin was so scarce that it was reserved exclusively for the Imperial household and the highest-ranking officers. Watanabe had only read about it in medical journals, never touched it. Now it was injected into his veins as casually as if it were salt or sugar. He waited for interrogation, for the inevitable moment when kindness would twist into cruelty. Yet, it never came. In the beds beside him lay wounded Americans, receiving the same treatment. His meals were identical to theirs. The same nurses who spoke softly to American soldiers checked his bandages. "I kept waiting for the torture to begin," he later wrote, in a letter never sent. "Instead, I received the same care as those who had fought against me. I could not comprehend such waste of resources on an enemy." This dissonance gnawed at him. The empire had told him that surrender was dishonor, that Americans were racially inferior, that their medicine was backward. Yet the stitches in his flesh told another story. The Solace was not propaganda, it was reality, undeniable and overwhelming. For men like Watanabe, the hospital ship was a floating paradox. Each operation was a betrayal of their indoctrination. Each meal, a strike against the empire's narrative. What had been presented as weakness, America's obsession with comfort, was in truth the reflection of an industrial and scientific base, so vast it could extend mercy, even to enemies. When Watanabe and 28 others were later transferred to Camp Livingston in Louisiana, the astonishment only deepened. But the first awakening came aboard the Solace, where a man who believed he had been saved only for interrogation realized instead that he was being saved for life. In that realization lay the beginning of a transformation that would ripple across thousands of prisoners. reshaping not only their war, but the Japan they would return to. Chapter 7. Louisiana Revelations. The train that ferried the wounded into Louisiana carried more than bandaged bodies. It hauled a cargo of certainties that would not survive the week. When Lieutenant Kenji Watanabe and nearly 30 other Japanese prisoners stepped down at Camp Livingston in February of the year 1943, winter sunlight lay flat across the pines, and the cinder platform smelled of coal and creosote. Guards gave orders brisk and watchful, but what followed those orders was not cruelty or spectacle. It was ordinary, almost indifferent efficiency. Inside the military hospital, routine moved like clockwork wound by invisible hands. A corpsman ticked names against a clipboard with mechanical precision. A nurse read temperatures and pulses, pencil tapping with metronomic calm. An orderly shuttled men to the X-ray room and back, steering wheelchairs with a kind of practiced invisibility. The ward was bright even in late afternoon. Windows were clear. Floors held a soft waxed shine. Sheets were drawn so tight a coin might bounce. For men who had last seen their reflections in jungle puddles, the clarity felt like an accusation. Meals arrived like church bells, morning, noon, and night with a regularity that felt ceremonial. Trays clattered softly. Rubber wheels whispered along linoleum. The air filled with the blunt, almost holy smell of protein. There was meat at midday, and meat again at evening. Baked, braised, stewed. Soups were thick, milk was cold, bread warm, potatoes steaming when split open. Each patient received enough protein in a single day to equal what Watanabe had struggled to allocate across an entire week in the field. The arithmetic contained its own politics. The supply room severed the last thread of doubt. When Watanabe asked for fresh dressings and a thermometer to track a low fever, the attendant nodded, disappeared, and returned with an armload as casually as if he had fetched firewood. Straight-edge scalpels lay in trays like silver cutlery laid for a banquet. Hemostats stood in perfect ranks. Boxes of gauze were stacked shoulder-high. Bottles of sulfa powder crowded one another until their labels formed a tessellated pattern. In a locked cabinet rested penicillin, the miracle he had read about in journals in Tokyo, sitting there like ordinary stock. He never expected to see it used as freely as salt. When his fever ticked upward at dusk, a nurse consulted his chart, vanished, and returned with a syringe. The injection stung. Near dawn, the fever broke. Watanabe did not celebrate. He lay staring at the ceiling, counting what the needle implied. Laboratories by the dozen, factories by the score, trains moving through the night, refrigerated rail cars, distribution schedules, warehouses, quartermasters. And at the end of that chain, a nurse who could draw a dose without asking permission. The medicine was not mercy. It was logistics. He was not alone in his reckoning. In the next bed, a naval infantry sergeant flexed fingers that should have been lost. In the jungle, where infection eats faster than a surgeon can cut, his forearm would have been taken at the elbow to save his life. At Livingston, vascular repair and steady hands preserved the limb. When the sergeant asked the American doctor why anyone would spend hours restoring the arm of an enemy, the physician frowned as if the question itself were confused. "Because you are a patient," he said. The sentence was so flat, it felt like policy carved in stone. Suspicion did not vanish in a day. Some men hid crusts of bread in their pockets, slept without eating, or whispered strategies for resisting imagined interrogation. The ward replied by doing the same thing tomorrow and the next day. Morning rounds brought the same faces and the same calm questions. Dressings were changed twice daily, and the used bandages were thrown away after one use. A bucket filled with discarded gauze looked to Watanabe like a ledger written in the language of waste. He tried to translate, and could not. In his world, there were no words for throwing away what you could wash, dry, and use again. It was the casualness that unstitched men's certainties, the sense that no one was trying to impress them. There were no speeches, no guided tours, staged for enemy eyes, no cameras. The machine of care ran because it had been built to run, and if captured Japanese were swept along in its momentum, that was merely the byproduct of a system too large to notice the politics of a single bed. At mealtimes, the shock twisted into something harder to name. Men who had stretched 100 grams of rice across 15 mouths stared at plates they could not finish. A patient at the end of the row pushed away a bowl of beef stew, apologizing to no one. Another asked for less butter on his bread. The sight drove a splinter of shame beneath the fingernails of pride. A private from Tokyo told an interpreter that he ate better as a prisoner than his sisters ate at home. Chapter 8. Food as a Weapon. Armies have always marched on their stomachs. Watanabe's ward taught him that some armies win there as surely as on any map. At Camp Livingston and later at Camp McCoy, menus were designed by dietitians, not by nostalgia or luck. The phrase itself felt like a taunt from a gentler world designed dietitians, but the results were decisive. A typical daily allowance for a prisoner included meat measured in ounces, vegetables in double digits, potatoes or their substitutes by the pound, dried beans by the handful, bread in thick slices, coffee in rationed cups, fats and oils in careful spoons, and smaller allotments of fruit, sugar, and milk. The arithmetic added up to roughly 3,500 calories, a figure that sounded to many like fiction, especially to men from cities where civilian rations had fallen below 1,800 calories by the year 1944. Those numbers would have remained abstractions if they had not shown up as strength in the mirror. Records at Livingston noted that Japanese prisoners arrived, on average, nearly 1/4 below standard body weight for their height. After months on the camp diet, the deficit shrank to a margin. Diseases of deficiency, beriberi, and pellagra faded within weeks. Dental abscesses that had pulsed for years were treated. Some men slept a whole night for the first time in memory, without the throb of a tooth to wake them. Food did more than repair bodies, it reoriented minds. In Guadalcanal's closing months, a cook's assistant had rationed a single day's rice, barely 100 grams, across 15 soldiers, stretching the starch with jungle plants he could not always name. At Livingston, he watched American patients complain gently about a stew he would have served to officers at home. They left food on plates. They ordered coffee and did not finish it. He could not decide whether the sight enraged or educated him. In the end, it did both. At Camp McCoy, the logic of menus became a geography of abundance. Winter in Wisconsin is a test that yields simple grades: warm or cold, fed or unfed. The barracks were heated against a wind that could skin the face. Each man received 2 wool blankets. The kitchen served 3 meals that changed often enough to keep appetite interested and reliable. Meat appeared in portions that would have been festive in Tokyo. Vegetables arrived in 2s and 3s. Potatoes or their alternatives landed heavy and welcome. The diet was not indulgence, it was design. What startled prisoners most was not merely plenitude, but the system that protected it from chance. If onions ran short, the kitchen pivoted to cabbage without drama. If a shipment of potatoes arrived late, cooks turned to rice or pasta without apology. The food was not a miracle that might desert them. It was a plan that could flex, a web of substitutions designed to keep calories steady. Hunger's logic is simple. If today is better than yesterday, perhaps tomorrow will be worse. The camp menus contradicted that logic, day after predictable day. The effect on morale was paradoxical. Abundant food made men more cooperative, fewer outbursts, better sleep, steadier attention in language classes and on work details. It also sharpened a quieter shame when news filtered in from home. A prisoner, who knew his mother counted rice grain by grain, could not look directly at a plate that carried a meat portion measured in ounces. Gratitude and guilt lived side by side, quarreling in the same chest. The Americans did not hide their abundance. They organized it. Prisoners saw lists tacked to kitchen corkboards, purchasing schedules, delivery windows, cold storage temperatures. They watched men in white coats check thermometers and note numbers with pencils that never seemed to dull. It dawned on them that food in America was a choreography with many dancers. Farmers, railmen, quartermasters, cooks, and quiet experts with slide rules who could plan a winter's supply so that even an enemy ate on time. Among the prisoners was Captain Masao Nishimura, a former supply officer who had measured food in grams until the numbers felt like a second language. At McCoy, he watched two cooks slap down tins of fat like gamblers, laying chips, and felt his scalp prickle. In 1 week, he later wrote in a hidden notebook, he saw more fats and proteins distributed to prisoners than he could requisition for a company in a month in the Philippines. In the Japanese army, requests for extra blankets or lamp oil required forms and signatures and delays that mocked need. Here, a requisition was a walk to a storeroom. Food also taught values. Men trained to believe that Americans were racially hostile, watched cooks serve from the same pot to Germans, Italians, and Japanese. A guard who joked with a German prisoner did not change expression when handing a bowl to a Japanese. On days when meat was tougher than usual or coffee weaker than habit liked, the loudest grumbling came from Americans recovering from their own wounds. Even the complaints taught something. Prosperity breeds expectations, and expectations, when met, become trust. Not every lesson was gentle. Some men hoarded crusts tucked into lockers, butter wrapped in napkins and hidden beneath mattresses. Inspections found the caches. Guards confiscated the spoils and issued warnings. The hoarders were not greedy. They were haunted. In their minds, a ship might fail to arrive. A kitchen might go silent. A winter storm might sever the artery that fed the camp. But weeks passed, then months, and the artery never clotted. Slowly, hoarding eased. Not because men became virtuous, but because the system proved itself. The phrase that had begun as a private joke hotel bloomed into a vernacular. It was not that the infirmary felt like a resort. It was that, compared to the jungle and to memories of hospitals at home, where cloth was washed to threads and anesthesia was a bottle clutched to a mouth, the camp clinic offered a predictability that felt luxurious. If you had a cough, the staff brought a towel and a lesson. If you had a fever, you received a needle and a night's rest. If you had an appetite, the ladle came again without fuss. Food did not end the war, but it shortened the distance to its probable end inside the minds of those who ate. Each full tray was another argument for inevitability. Each week without a missed meal drew a line from factory to field, to railcar, to kitchen, to the flesh of a former enemy. The line was not propaganda. It was breakfast, lunch, and supper. It was the unromantic power of logistics declaring itself without music. It was the quiet, iron logic beneath the word the prisoners had chosen for their place of healing. Hotel. Chapter 9. Winter in Wisconsin. Wisconsin's winter is a test that punishes the unprepared. Yet for the Japanese prisoners who stepped off the train at Camp McCoy in early 1943, the shock was not the cold alone. It was the abundance that met it. Snow lay on the fields like bleached linen. Pines stood rigid against winds that sliced cheeks raw. Breath froze in midair, curling into clouds. Men who had sweated through the jungles of Guadalcanal now stumbled, clutching their thin uniforms around them, expecting misery. Instead, barracks doors opened to warmth. Inside, iron stoves burned steadily, fueled by coal deliveries that seemed endless. Heat filled every corner, a luxury even officers in Tokyo rarely enjoyed in winter. The first night, prisoners received 2 wool blankets each. The weight of the fabric startled them. It was soft, thick, smelling faintly of lanolin. In the jungle, men had curled around one another for warmth, fighting mosquitoes and rain. Here, a blanket was not a communal asset but an individual right. When some complained of lingering cold, additional blankets were provided without hesitation. Captain Masao Nishimura, the former supply officer, stared as guards hauled in stacks from storage, shaking his head. In his army, such a request would have died beneath paperwork. At McCoy, the response came in minutes. Meals at McCoy deepened the contrast. Dietitians rotated menus with a precision that felt like a second front in the war. Prisoners received beef one day, pork the next, chicken the day after. Vegetables were steamed, boiled, or served in salads. Potatoes, rice, or pasta appeared in rotation. Bread, still warm from the ovens, arrived in thick slices. Each tray contained enough calories to double the daily intake of civilians in Japan by 1944. Prisoners whispered that America must be squandering its reserves. Yet weeks passed, and the trays never grew lighter. The infirmary amplified this vision of reliability. Every new arrival underwent a medical examination. Chest auscultations, blood pressure checks, dental inspections. To men accustomed to field hospitals where only the gravely wounded were examined, the thoroughness was bewildering. Dental care especially struck them as decadent. In Japan, tooth extractions without anesthetic were common. At McCoy, cavities were drilled and filled. Abscesses were drained under local anesthesia. Prisoners received toothbrushes, toothpaste, and instructions on hygiene. The memory of reusing cloth as bandages in Guadalcanal's mud contrasted so violently with the abundance here that disbelief turned into quiet resignation. Outside the infirmary, the camp reflected the same logistical might. Workshops buzzed with activity. Classrooms offered English lessons, and a library lent books in multiple languages. Snowstorms howled across the plains, but supply lines never faltered. Coal arrived, food arrived, medical supplies arrived. The rhythm of delivery was as steady as the tick of a clock. For men raised to believe America was decadent and weak, the evidence was crushing. The machine of abundance did not stumble even in the dead of winter. For the first time, many prisoners began to articulate what had lurked unspoken. Japan could not win. Lieutenant Yasujiro Ogata, a former theology student turned soldier, wrote secretly in his diary, "The Americans waste more than we use. Their supplies seem endless. Did our leaders truly believe we could outlast such power?" He scribbled the words late at night, hiding the notebook under straw bedding, ashamed yet compelled. Outside, the wind screamed, but inside the barracks the stove glowed steady. Chapter 10. The Hotel Myth. It began as a joke, whispered between bunks. A prisoner at McCoy had written in a censored letter, later intercepted by camp authorities, "If you feel unwell, report to the infirmary. It is like a hotel. The beds have sheets, the food improves, and the nurses smile." Gaining weight with every retelling. Soon, hotel became camp slang for the medical wards. Men laughed when they said it, but beneath the humor lay a confession. The care they received was beyond anything they had known in uniform. The hotel metaphor spread because it captured the paradox of captivity. Prisoners were enemies, stripped of weapons and freedom. Yet in the infirmary, they were patients, given sheets, food, and medicine, without hesitation. To call it a hotel was to acknowledge both disbelief and irony. In Tokyo, families scrounged for rice. In Guadalcanal, comrades had died of infected wounds for lack of sulfa drugs. Yet here, appendicitis brought immediate surgery. Toothaches ended in clean extractions. Coughs were met with chest x-rays. It was as though surrender had delivered them into a parallel world. American intelligence officers took note. Reports recorded with faint amusement that Japanese prisoners referred to the infirmaries as hotels. One officer wrote, "The terminology indicates favorable impression of treatment received." It was evidence of psychological impact, perhaps even propaganda value. To the prisoners, it was survival coded as humor. Laughing at the word softened the humiliation of dependence, even as the reality of abundance eroded their indoctrination. Not all welcomed the transformation. Sergeant Hideo Takahashi, captured on Saipan, refused food for 3 days upon arrival. He believed meals were drugged. Nurses watched patiently as his strength waned. Only when he saw other Japanese patients eat and recover did he relent. His first cautious bites tasted not of treachery, but of potatoes and beef. He confided to an interpreter, "Good treatment made no sense. We were told Americans tortured prisoners. Yet here I am alive." Others felt guilt more than relief. Private Juro Tanaka wrote in a censored letter, "I eat better here than my family in Tokyo. The dishonor is unbearable. He tried to save scraps of bread to send home, not grasping that no package could cross the ocean. During inspections, guards often found hoarded food hidden in lockers or beneath blankets. To punish or humiliate was unnecessary. The shame of discovery was punishment enough. The irony of abundance was cruel. To be an enemy fed better than family was, to live in a hotel that mocked memory. By mid-1943, the phrase, hotel, had become more than slang. The infirmary represented everything propaganda had denied: cleanliness, care, abundance, and equality. Nurses treated Japanese and American patients side by side. Doctors performed surgeries on men who had aimed rifles at them weeks before. Blankets, food, and medicine arrived without discrimination. The hotel became a metaphor not for luxury, but for a world in which human life was treated with a value unfamiliar to men raised under imperial militarism. Inside the wards, suspicion gave way to grudging acceptance, then to reflection, diaries filled with hesitant admissions. "If this is our enemy, then we misunderstood," wrote Lieutenant Ogata. The word hotel carried irony, but it also carried truth. A hospital that resembled comfort more than punishment. A prison that resembled survival more than despair. In the end, it was the smallest phrase, 2 syllables, that captured the collapse of a worldview. Chapter 11. Psychological Collapse. Suspicion was the first instinct of nearly every Japanese soldier captured alive. They had been trained since childhood to believe that surrender was worse than death. Manuals insisted that Americans tortured captives for information, then discarded their bodies. That narrative clung stubbornly to the minds of men even when the evidence around them denied it. For days, some prisoners ate cautiously, picking at food, certain that hidden poisons lingered in the gravy. Others slept with shoes on, expecting guards to storm the barracks at night. Every kindness looked like camouflage for a cruelty not yet revealed. But suspicion cannot survive indefinitely against routine. At Camp McCoy and Camp Livingston, the ordinary became the extraordinary. Food arrived at set times, neither late nor short. Medical rounds came with the same calm voices. Bandages were changed without calculation. Surgeries were scheduled with the same precision as if the patient wore an American uniform. The absence of betrayal began to weigh heavier than the threat of it. If the cruelty never came, then the indoctrination had lied. For some, this realization detonated like a shell inside the mind. Private Teo Shimizu, weak from malaria, wrote in a letter never sent home, "I am ashamed to tell you, I am well fed while you hunger. I have gained weight in captivity. Medicines I had never seen before healed me. Our leaders miscalculated beyond forgiveness." His words, intercepted by censors, revealed the corrosion of certainty. The enemy's food did more than fill stomachs. It starved ideology. The weight of guilt often accompanied recovery. Men who had fought beside starving comrades now found themselves gaining pounds in captivity. Some tried to ration themselves, leaving half-finished plates. Others hoarded food, attempting to store abundance, as though famine might return overnight. Inspections uncovered butter, wrapped in napkins, crusts of bread tucked into boots, sugar cubes hidden beneath bedding. The hoarders were not thieves. They were men trapped between memory and present reality. Each cache was a prayer against a world too generous to trust. Camp psychologists, who quietly observed prisoners, coined a phrase, productive fatalism. Unlike German captives, who often clung to hope of a final victory, Japanese prisoners began to accept defeat early. The abundance around them was irrefutable evidence of industrial power beyond imagination. Lieutenant Ogata's diary charted the progression. In March of 1943, he wrote, "This abundance must be propaganda." By April, perhaps our leaders underestimated this nation's capacity. By June, Japan cannot win this war. Their factories allow them to be soft and powerful at once. It is a terrible combination for us. This collapse of belief did not mean joy at defeat. It meant despair, resignation, and an odd clarity. Many prisoners began to measure time not by the war's battles, but by their meals and medical visits. Survival became certain, but victory for Japan evaporated from imagination. To call the infirmary a hotel was to laugh at the absurdity of captivity and to hide the deeper admission that the empire had lied. And the enemy had outbuilt not just Japan's factories, but its faith. Chapter 12. Doctors in Captivity. If food and blankets shook the foundation of propaganda, medical care cracked it open. Among the prisoners were men with professional training, army medics, naval physicians, surgeons who had practiced in Tokyo before the war. They were not supposed to be impressed. They had been told that American medicine lagged behind Japanese tradition, that discipline outweighed technology, that spirit triumphed over science. Yet inside the camp infirmaries, every procedure contradicted those lessons. Dr. Shiro Ishihara was one such man. A veteran physician of the Imperial Navy, he had treated wounds aboard ships with dwindling supplies, improvising anesthetics and sterilizing instruments until they wore down to uselessness. Captured when his hospital vessel sank off Guadalcanal in late 1942, he expected neglect or humiliation. Instead, he was offered a chance to observe surgeries at Camp McCoy. What he saw unsettled him. Antibiotics flowed in doses so large he thought them reckless, yet infection rates plummeted. Instruments gleamed with a polish beyond anything he had handled in Tokyo. Anesthesia was administered with a calm certainty that left patients resting peacefully, not writhing in half-conscious agony. I was forced, he later wrote in notes discovered after his death, to conclude that much of what I had been taught was false. Their medicine was not primitive. It was abundant, systematic, and effective. The shock rippled beyond Ishihara. Other captured medics compared notes, astonished at the steady stream of sulfa powders, morphine, sterile bandages, and surgical gloves used once and discarded. To men trained to preserve every scrap, the waste seemed decadent, yet the outcomes undeniable. Wounds healed faster. Amputations were fewer. Lives thought lost were restored. The hotel was not metaphor alone. It was evidence of a system that valued even the enemy's life. American staff sometimes allowed Japanese doctors to assist, handing them instruments, inviting them to observe recovery wards, explaining techniques in broken English or through interpreters. What began as humiliation transformed into fascination. Prisoners kept secret notebooks, sketching diagrams, writing down drug names, describing sterilization methods. These were not the scribbles of curiosity, but the records of men already thinking of Japan's future. If defeat was inevitable, perhaps knowledge could be salvaged from it. The cultural shock was profound. These doctors had been told that Americans were racially prejudiced, that Japanese captives would be treated worse than Europeans. Yet they watched American nurses move from German to Italian to Japanese patients with the same calm hands. They saw dental surgeons repair teeth in mouths that spoke 3 different languages. They witnessed appendicitis treated in hours with surgery that in Tokyo would have been reserved for officers or the wealthy. The Americans appear to place the same value on all human lives, one prisoner observed. This is not what we were taught. In the evenings, doctors spoke quietly among themselves in barracks corners. Some were ashamed to admit admiration. Others argued fiercely that Japan must learn from what they were seeing. Ishihara's conclusion spread, that abundance was not by accident, but design. That medicine here was an extension of the same industrial might that built ships in days and aircraft in thousands. America's strength was not only in bombs and bullets, it was in gauze, penicillin, and the hand of a nurse who treated every patient like a human being. Chapter 13. Learning from Abundance. By the year 1944, the disbelief that once shadowed every meal had given way to curiosity. Suspicion faded, not because the prisoners had chosen trust, but because the system around them never faltered. The carts rolled in with food, the nurses with bandages, the doctors with steady hands. Men who had first whispered, "hotel," in jest, now began to think, like students lodged inside a vast academy of logistics. If the Empire of Japan was destined to lose, then perhaps lessons could be salvaged from defeat. Requests for books in English multiplied. Dictionaries circulated through barracks, their pages smudged with pencil notes. Some men began keeping notebooks, recording not just words but observations, how supplies were stored, how nurses disposed of dressings, how orderlies sterilized instruments. Agricultural specialists watched kitchens closely, noting quantities of flour and beans. Mechanics marveled at the tools in workshops, each maintained in good condition, none scavenged from ruins. Doctors copied down drug names, dosages, and sterilization techniques, writing by candlelight in the corners of barracks. Work programs offered another education. Unlike German prisoners, many Japanese volunteered not merely for diversion or canteen credit, but to study American methods firsthand. Some requested assignments in farm details, hoping to see machinery at work. One agricultural graduate, Sergeant Matsuru Tanaka, observed that a single American farmer, with a tractor, produced what 20 Japanese laborers managed by hand. He marveled at the rhythm of machines, the fuel burned casually, yet saving thousands of hours of human labor. His notes later became part of Japan's post-war agricultural reforms. Medical officers among the prisoners grew particularly attentive. They shadowed American doctors, watched surgeries, and noted how antibiotics were measured. For them, every discarded bandage was not just waste, but proof of scale. One physician confided in his diary, "Abundance here is not luxury, but strategy. They can afford to prevent infection rather than fight it. This saves men, time, and effort. It is more efficient than sacrifice." That efficiency contradicted the Japanese creed that valor outweighed logistics. Camp McCoy became less a prison than a paradoxical classroom. Prisoners did not embrace American culture with joy, but they could not ignore its effectiveness. The humor in the word hotel masked a deeper truth. Many of them were taking notes, preparing for a time when Japan would need rebuilding. They saw that America's power was not just weapons, but systems that fed, healed, and educated even an enemy. To ignore those lessons would have been as foolish as denying the warmth of the barracks stove in Wisconsin's winter. Chapter 14. Breaking Racial Myths. Imperial propaganda had insisted that Americans despised Japanese more than any European foe. The soldiers were told to expect cruelty, racial slurs, and neglect. Yet reality at the camps eroded those certainties. Guards enforced discipline, but institutional treatment rarely differed between German, Italian, and Japanese captives. Food came from the same pots, blankets from the same storerooms, medicines from the same cabinets. This equality, unthinkable to men raised on imperial hierarchy, forced a painful reassessment. Corporal Masahiro Yoshida, captured on Tinian in July 1944, recorded his astonishment. "The Americans separate us from Germans but provide the same food, the same medical care, the same living conditions. This contradicts all training. They treat us not worse, not better, simply the same." His words mirrored dozens of diaries later discovered, each a small crack in the wall of propaganda. The infirmary played the sharpest role in this collapse of racial myth. In its wards, Japanese lay beside Germans, both receiving anesthesia, antibiotics, and post-operative care. Nurses adjusted pillows without regard to nationality. Surgeons worked on enemy flesh with the same meticulous attention they gave their own. For men raised to believe that Americans were racially inferior, this parity was destabilizing. Equality itself became evidence of power. The empire that had insisted on racial hierarchy was shown powerless before a system that ignored such distinctions. Some resisted the implication, clinging to the idea that it was all theater. Yet no stage could sustain the illusion for months. Bandages changed themselves. Meals arrived, unaccompanied by cameras. A soldier recovering from appendicitis saw the stitches in his abdomen heal faster than any he had treated in comrades. He could not deny what his body confirmed. Breaking racial myths also revealed the fragility of Japanese indoctrination. If Americans were not the cruel, inferior enemy described in schoolbooks, then perhaps other lessons had been lies as well. Private Ichiro Fujioto, a former university student, whispered to a fellow prisoner, "We were told democracy produced chaos." Yet here, guards from many states, many ancestries, work together without disorder. Their system appears to function, despite its apparent disunity. The metaphor of the hotel now carried not only irony, but also revelation. It was not just that infirmaries resembled hotels, compared to the misery of Japanese field hospitals. It was that the very act of treating enemies as human beings defied the racial creed hammered into every soldier. To admit the hospital felt like a hotel was to concede that the world outside Japan might not fit the empire's categories. And once a man questioned those categories, defeat ceased to be only military. It became ideological. Chapter 15. Letters never sent. Prisoners wrote constantly, though few of their words would ever reach Japan. The censors intercepted nearly all correspondence, translating each line, filing it, and storing it away in folders that would gather dust until war's end. For the men who wrote them, letters were not only appeals to family, they were confessions, journals, and safety valves. Paper became the only place where contradictions could live without argument. Private Teo Shimizu's words carried the weight of betrayal and shame. "I eat better here, though I am an enemy, than my own brothers do at home. I have gained weight, my wounds are healed, and I sleep without hunger. Our leaders misjudged terribly." He folded the page carefully, addressed it to his parents in Tokyo, and handed it to a guard, never knowing it would be opened, read, and stored in an archive he would never see. Other letters echoed the same themes: disbelief at abundance, guilt at survival, and astonishment at equality. A cook's assistant wrote, "The Americans waste more food on one tray than we ate in a week. I cannot finish what they give me. I am ashamed." Another prisoner scribbled by lantern light, "I have seen medicines I once thought existed only for the emperor. Here they are used on me, an enemy soldier. How can this be?" To censors, these words were intelligence proof that propaganda was unraveling. To the prisoners, the act of writing was an exorcism. Ink allowed them to set down what mouths could not safely speak in barracks, filled with suspicion and pride. The letters captured the psychological shift more vividly than any diary. They were, in a sense, reports to the future, testimony for a Japan that would one day have to understand why it had lost. The cruelest irony lay in the silence that followed. Families in Japan never received the reassurances, the apologies, or the revelations. Mothers never read of their son's recovery. Fathers never heard confessions of doubt. Sisters never saw promises to return. The letters became time capsules buried in military cabinets, opened only after surrender, when they revealed a chorus of voices already broken free of indoctrination. Each sheet of paper was a window, and behind it, the hotel stood gleaming with lights that families in Tokyo could never imagine. Chapter 16. News from home. If letters traveled outward into silence, news traveled inward with devastating clarity. By 1944, newly captured prisoners carried rumors of Japan itself unraveling. Rations in major cities had fallen below 1,000 calories a day. Children fainted in schools. Families lined up for hours for scraps of rice or barley. Hospitals were reusing bandages 10 times. Surgeries were performed without anesthesia, and civilians traded heirlooms for medicine that no longer existed. When these stories reached Camp McCoy or Camp Livingston, they collided with the lived reality of abundance. A man recovering from appendicitis, stitched with fresh sutures, learned that his daughter in Tokyo might die of tuberculosis untreated. Captain Toshio Nakamura, captured on Iwo Jima in 1945, broke down in tears when shown the camp infirmary's stocked cabinets. "My daughter coughs blood in Tokyo," he confessed. "Here you give me medicines without hesitation. She will die while I recover." His anguish spread like contagion among his comrades, transforming gratitude into guilt. The news came not only through prisoners, but also through radio broadcasts monitored by interpreters. Firebombing raids over Tokyo and Osaka reduced districts to ashes. Supply lines collapsed under submarine attacks. Civilians starved while prisoners of war in Wisconsin ate 3,000 calories daily. The inversion of suffering gnawed at consciences already bruised. Men began to confess in whispers, "Better to surrender quickly, if only so our families may eat." Camp authorities noted the change. Cooperation increased, not from affection for guards but from calculation. If America triumphed sooner, perhaps Japan's agony would end sooner. The hospital became the symbol of this paradox. Every bandage, every dose of penicillin, every warm blanket reminded prisoners of the difference between their survival and their families' suffering. To call it a hotel was now more than irony, it was accusation. Why should enemies live in comfort while one's own blood starved at home? The weight of this contradiction pressed hardest on officers. Supply specialists, like Captain Nishimura, who understood logistics intimately, admitted in diaries that Japan's leadership had entered a war blind. "We measure in grams," he wrote. "They measure in pounds. We count each calorie, they discard them. I once believed sacrifice would triumph over luxury. Now, I see sacrifice alone leads to ruin." The barracks whispered with these realizations. Men still bowed before the flag when ordered, but in their private words, the war had already been lost. The infirmaries' clean sheets became more than comfort. They became symbols of a nation's miscalculation, reminders that while they healed, Japan bled. Chapter 17. Occupation Bridges. When the Emperor's voice crackled through radios on the 15th day of August in the year 1945, surrender did not merely end a war. It erased an entire map of meaning. Tokyo's neighborhoods lay in cinders, factories were gutted, and rail lines curled like burnt wire. Into this vacuum stepped General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters, a government made of clipboard, pencil, and an almost missionary certainty that Japan could be rebuilt. GHQ needed local allies who understood both the broken country and the functioning machine that had defeated it. Unexpectedly, a small cohort of former prisoners of war, men who had stared at apple pie on hospital trays and called infirmaries hotels, were ready. They possessed a kind of double vision. On one side were memories of Guadalcanal, hunger and bandages boiled to threads. On the other, the repetition of American logistics. Carts that appeared on schedule, pharmacies stocked like libraries, kitchens that turned calories into morale. That double vision made them valuable translators of language, yes, but also of systems. MacArthur's staff sifted applications and sought out professionals. Doctors who had observed appendectomies under calm anesthesia in Camp McCoy now walked through ruined Tokyo wards, showing nurses how to glove and mask. Not as ceremony, but as barrier. Agricultural graduates who had watched tractors bite Wisconsin fields spoke to prefectural officials about mechanization, crop rotation, and the mathematics of fertilizer. Engineers who had traced assembly line choreography in camp workshops drew sketches for small factories that could be restarted with scavenged belts and motors. Kenji Watanabe, the medical officer who had first awakened beneath the bright lights of the hospital ship, wrote to GHQ with startling humility. During 3 years as a prisoner, he had watched the unromantic heroism of prevention, sterile technique that made infection rare, antibiotics used early rather than desperately, public health habits turned into muscle memory. These systems, he argued, can be adapted to Japanese conditions. His English was careful, his conclusion unambiguous. In neighborhoods where fear of the occupier ran high, returned POWs became cultural mediators. They could explain that the American insistence on schedules was not cruelty but habit, that the form at the window was not an insult, but a map for making things happen. They answered questions that villagers were too proud to ask of soldiers. Why measure chlorine in drops? Why boil instruments for minutes rather than moments? Why throw away a bandage that looks clean? Their answers did not cite ideology. They cited outcomes: lower fevers, fewer funerals, quicker recoveries. Surveys conducted by occupation officials in the year 1946 found a curious pattern. Wards and towns with returned POWs registered fewer rumors and more cooperation. The reason was not love of the occupier. It was the credibility of men who had already survived the collapse of propaganda. When these former captives said, "This will work," they were believed because they had once been certain of something else and been proven wrong. Some of these bridges were literal. A former supply officer stood on a half-destroyed span over a river in a provincial city and explained to a mixed crew of American engineers and Japanese carpenters how to jack and shim, girder by girder, until the deck could carry trucks again. He possessed no blueprints, only a memory of how American maintenance crews had moved material with jigs and levers, not with heroics. The bridge reopened in weeks, and with it came food, medicine, and a new habit of thinking. Plan first, then exertion. In clinics, former POW physicians argued for triage that respected need, not rank. A fisherman's infection was not less urgent than a clerk's because uniform or lineage demanded it. The lesson had been learned under barbed wire, where an enemy's wound had received the same glove, the same suture, the same penicillin as a compatriot's. In a country steeped in hierarchy, this was a quiet revolution, smuggled in as hospital routine. Through it all, the metaphor of the hotel shifted meaning. It no longer described astonishment at comfort. It described a standard: clean sheets, hot meals, predictable care that could be pursued even in a starved nation. The former prisoners carried that standard in notebooks and in muscle memory. They were not naive about scarcity. They knew Japan could not conjure antibiotics by will. But they knew systems that reduced waste and infection. And they had seen that compassion, when married to logistics, multiplied results. The bridges they built were pragmatic, made of schedules and habits. They connected Wisconsin kitchens to Tokyo soup lines, McCoy infirmaries to Shinjuku clinics, Camp Livingston routines to prefectural health offices. And as those bridges held, an older edifice, the indoctrination that had equated mercy with weakness, continued to crumble. Chapter 18. Seeds of Reconstruction. Reconstruction did not begin with speeches. It began with a broom, a ledger, a bucket of disinfectant, and a habit of writing things down. In the winter that followed surrender, a chill wind combed through gaps in bombed walls as former POWs taught nurses how to time a boil and how to fold a towel to brace an incision when a patient coughed. They showed orderlies how to line up bottles and instruments in the same order on every tray so that a hand could reach without looking and find what it needed in an emergency. These were small seeds, but they were the kind that germinate. Dr. Shiro Ishihara, once dismissive of American techniques, then converted by what he had witnessed, compiled a short manual that circulated hand to hand. Its principles were simple: sterilize thoroughly, glove always, mask whenever a cough threatens, treat pain so that the body spends energy healing rather than enduring, and favor prevention because it is cheaper in lives than heroics. Where penicillin was scarce, he described wound care that minimized contamination. Where bandage stock ran low, he insisted on reuse only with proper re-sterilization and strict rotation. The goal was not to imitate wealth, but to translate method. Public health campaigns bloomed from the same soil. Former prisoners worked with occupation officials to map latrine placement in crowded neighborhoods, to chlorinate wells, to schedule vaccination drives that reached into alleys and tenements. The language of these efforts was humbly technical parts per million, minutes at a rolling boil, doses by weight, but in those numbers lived the possibility of a city that would not bury its children for lack of simple measures. On farms, the lessons of Camp McCoy's kitchens and supply lines metamorphosed into new practices. Sergeant Matsaru Tanaka, the agricultural graduate, who had watched tractors carve neat furrows through Wisconsin frost, returned to a countryside plowed by human backs. He preached mechanization not as an insult to tradition, but as a rescue of time. One machine could open ground for 20 families. A cooperative could own what a single farmer could not. He taught rotation to rest soil, composting to stretch fertilizer, and shared repair depots so that a broken gasket did not ruin a harvest. The same spirit entered workshops. Engineers who had sketched American assembly benches on notebook paper now walked the wreckage of small factories. They salvaged motors, aligned pulleys, and rigged jigs from scrap so that parts would be drilled to the same mark every morning. Quality no longer meant the brilliance of a single craftsman. It meant the discipline of a process. Waste the kind that had once been sanctified as sacrifice was hunted, named, and eliminated. In the year 1949, a former prisoner named Tadashi Yamamoto joined Toyota Motor Corporation. He had swung a hammer on camp maintenance crews and watched American supply chains deliver parts the way a river delivers silt constantly, predictably, and with force. At Toyota, he spoke a heresy learned in captivity. Scale without discipline is waste. Discipline without scale is starvation. The company did not change overnight, but over years it learned to fuse American bigness with Japanese exactness. A marriage that would transform assembly lines into something leaner and harder to disrupt. Business memoirs and interviews from later decades would try to find a moment when everything turned. They would point to a plant manager's insight or a consultant's chart. But somewhere beneath those legends lay quieter origins. A former POW explaining how a storeroom should be labeled so that parts could be found in the dark. A foreman reminding a crew that a jig removes argument. A clerk insisting that deliveries be logged by hour, not by mood. The hotel metaphor followed these seeds into boardrooms and classrooms. It became shorthand for what a system ought to feel like from the inside. Clean, on time, with the right tool in the right drawer, the right dose in the right vial, the right part on the right hook. It was not luxury. It was predictability. In a nation that had learned to praise endurance, predictability felt like mercy. Former prisoners did not claim credit. Many carried their camp notebooks in coat pockets until the paper thinned and the corners wore away. They had no interest in triumphal narratives. They were too busy converting memory into method, penicillin into protocol, soup line arithmetic into procurement plans, a nurse's folded towel into a standard for post-operative care across city hospitals. As the 1950s opened, the harvest of these seeds was visible. Outbreaks shrank, clinic lines shortened. Children lived through winters that would have taken them a decade earlier. In workshops, scrap bins filled less quickly, while finished goods moved more smoothly. On farms, yields ticked upward as hands found other work to do. None of this felt cinematic. Yet it was the most cinematic thing of all. A montage of ordinary acts solving extraordinary problems. The irony that shadowed every improvement never entirely faded. Many of these seeds had been gathered behind fences, sown by men who had once whispered, "Hotel," to survive the humiliation of dependency. But the harvest belonged. Chapter 19. From hotels to industry. By the late 1940s, Japan's landscape was scarred but alive. Chimneys still stood crooked, rails bent, and homes collapsed into ash. Yet, within this wreckage, a new industrial rhythm was beginning to pulse, and many of its beats echoed lessons learned in American captivity. Former prisoners, once stunned by the waste of discarded bandages or food scraps, returned to Japan with notebooks full of observations. They had seen how predictability replaced improvisation, how abundance was managed rather than worshipped, and how logistics were as decisive as courage. Tadashi Yamamoto, who had repaired machinery in Camp McCoy, walked into Toyota's battered workshops in the year 1949 with an unusual vocabulary. He spoke of flow rather than output, of waste as an enemy more dangerous than shortages, of standardization as a form of mercy. His colleagues, still reeling from shortages and improvisation, initially resisted. But as production lines restarted, his insights made sense. American scale fused with Japanese discipline. What had once been a POW's quiet reflection in a Wisconsin barrack became the seed of lean manufacturing. This story was repeated across sectors. Engineers who had witnessed American shipyards producing Liberty ships in weeks argued that Japanese dockyards must focus not on heroic craftsmanship, but on doctors who had seen Camp Livingston's stockrooms filled with identical sterile packages, pressed for hospital procurement to favor uniformity and reliability. Agriculturalists who had counted tractors on Midwestern fields insisted that collective cooperatives pool resources for mechanization. Even cultural habits shifted. In Japan, hierarchy had long dictated who received the best, from officers to bureaucrats. But the former POWs remembered how, in the camp infirmaries, appendicitis was treated immediately, regardless of whether the patient wore stripes or bars. That principle, care according to need, not rank, slowly seeped into post-war hospitals and later into corporate ethics. By the mid-1950s, Japanese companies were experimenting with employee health systems and cafeterias that echoed the egalitarian meals once served to prisoners. The metaphor of the hotel evolved yet again. For the former POWs, it no longer meant luxury. It meant systematic comfort, beds ready, meals served, tools in place, medicines available, procedures predictable. In boardrooms and factories, the word circulated as shorthand for what an operation should feel like from within. Leaders invoked it when a line ran smoothly. It runs like a hotel. The memory of captivity had been transmuted into a philosophy of reconstruction. By the time Japanese exports began reaching American shores in the 1960s, many bore invisible fingerprints of these lessons. Radios, motorcycles, and later automobiles carried within them the logic of Camp McCoy storerooms and Livingston operating rooms. Japan was no longer the defeated nation of 1945. It was a rising power, its industries shaped not only by occupation policy, but also by the men who had once been enemies behind fences, astonished by meals they could scarcely finish. Chapter 20. The Irony of Victory. History loves ironies, and perhaps none is sharper than this. The war meant to preserve Japan's empire instead destroyed it, but in its ashes, Japan rebuilt by absorbing the very systems of its conqueror. And the first to glimpse that paradox were not politicians or scholars, but wounded soldiers, staring at trays of roast beef and apple pie in American hospitals. They had expected torture. They received penicillin. They had expected starvation. They received calories enough to gain weight. They had expected contempt. They received treatment as patients. From that shock was born a recognition that abundance was not weakness. It was power organized into systems. By the 1970s, Japan stood as an economic powerhouse. Its automobiles rivaled Detroit's. Its electronics filled homes across the globe. Its industries admired and feared. Beneath that transformation lay lessons whispered in camp bunks and recorded in secret diaries. Former POWs, once humiliated by their capture, had become bridges between defeat and renewal. They had carried the hotel in their memories, not as luxury, but as a model of order, care, and predictability. The irony is profound. Japan's leaders had warned that capture meant dishonor, that America was too decadent to fight. Yet the men who endured captivity returned with insights that helped reconstruct their nation. The indoctrination of decades collapsed, not under bombardment, but under the weight of meals too abundant to be propaganda. And so the story closes where it began, with a man staring at a tray of food, trembling hands, unsure whether to eat. That first bite, taken in disbelief, marked not just survival, but the beginning of a transformation. From those hospital hotels grew new practices in medicine, agriculture, and industry, practices that reshaped Japan's destiny. The great irony of the Pacific War is that Japan's defeat became its salvation, and the witnesses to that paradox were men who expected to die and instead learned how to live differently. Their journey from indoctrination to recognition is also the journey of Japan itself, from empire to ashes, from ashes to industry, from industry to global power.